you overweight and you're wondering, is there something in my childhood that is making me overweight? Well, in this video, I'm talking about the link between our childhood and obesity. So hi, I'm Vanessa McLennan, a clinical hypnotherapist, psychotherapist, and I help people to stop binge eating and overeating by healing them from the inside so that they can have a life free from food stress. So if you would like to know more about the connection between childhood and obesity, keep watching. You know, I think weight is just so misunderstood. You know, we think it's as easy as, well, just eat less and exercise more and hey, we all lose the weight. And if it was that easy, we'd all be super slim. And I think you get, slimming companies and gyms focus a lot on the diet and also on the exercise. And yes, that is really, really important. But I think they are missing a huge, great big link. And that is the psychology and the emotions of it, which a lot of the time come from childhood. Now, I think it gets missed because, it's not as easy to spot. It's not as tangible as being able to measure it. You can measure your exercise, measure your food, and then make that a direct link to weight loss. I also think, working on the emotional psychological side, it's not a quick fix. And that's what we're programmed to want to see in society, aren't we? We eat like cabbage soup for a week, we're going to lose loads of weight. But working on the inside, the inner us, it's not a linear, straightforward pattern, and there is so much, let's say, grey side to it, that it's often really hard to see the link between our eating and our childhood. So I'm going to give you 3 ways in which our childhood and our being overweight is affected by the way that we were perhaps brought up and our childhood. First way is brain development. When we are young, our brains, it's definitely between the ages of 0 to 3, our brains are developing so quickly, the fastest that they will ever grow in our life. I think it's about, by the time we're 3, 80% of our brain has already developed. And we grow what's called these neurons, which is like a pathway of networks, and that enables the brain to function, or enables us to think the way that we do. So it's like a motorway system. So every time we do something new, a little pathway is created. But when we tread down that pathway again and again, that pathway gets wider and it gets clearer. And in the end, like a motorway system, we just go down it very, very quickly. So that's like how our brain developed, like the road network system. So when we have, these repeated patterns again and again, we then don't even think about them. They just become a natural response. So in relation to trauma, we are developing then pathways around that trauma and in response to that. So we are then learning perhaps on how to respond to that trauma, how to survive, how to keep ourselves safe in some ways. And what this can then stop us from doing is developing pathways in other areas. So we may not be able to form better relationships, or we may not be able to read or write as fluently as we could do, but we can respond to trauma extremely well. So being able to respond to that trauma, it might manifest itself in us having to hide our emotions, in us learning how to please adults around us, in learning that if we behave a certain way, we'll get beaten, or certain way, and then somebody else will abuse us in some ways. So we learn very quickly, from the environment around us how to behave and how to be. So learning all of that is very stressful and it takes its toll, and then it stays with us throughout adulthood. We learn some ways that maybe all of this is our fault or our doing, but some of these behaviours then, like I say, we're going down the motorway, that network becomes so ingrained that we then no longer have to think about the response, it's automatic. And so then this manifests itself definitely in adulthood, because they all carry on through childhood, those behaviours, in just adverse behaviours like drinking, smoking, and food can be one of those, overeating. And so this is where then, unless we go back and work out why it's happening, we'll always have these patterns and we won't know sometimes why. Stress. When we feel stress, we go into what's called the flight or fight situation. That's adrenaline being released into us. And so hence we either want to put up a fight or we run. But when we're children, and if we are overloaded by stress constantly, this takes our toll. The adrenaline can wear out after a while. And again, we learn to respond to that stress, and soon it becomes normal, but our bodies are quite fatigued. Now, when we feel stressed and we feel drained, we need food to give us energy. So hence associations may be then made where we then feel stressed and we feel low, so we need a lot of food when we were children to just help keep us safe. That constant fight or flight situation can also lead us to having a love-hate relationship with food. We one day might fight it and, push it away, but then the next day we love it and we indulge too much. So there's this constant battle going on. And if you found that when you were a child there was a constant battle, this is how it might be replicating itself in your relationship with food. When we suffer trauma, it really changes the development of our brain. There is something called operant and classic conditioning, and that is based on positive or negative reinforcement. So in other words, we learn by the response that we get to that behaviour, and that response to that behaviour could either be positive or negative, and depending on that we might either do more of that behaviour or less than that behaviour. So it's the basis on what we let's say discipline and teach our children. So in other words, as a child we do something good, and then we get rewarded from it. So hence we will do that behaviour again. On the negative side is we do something bad and then we get disciplined, let's just say, for it, and the idea is that we never do that behaviour again. Not quite as black and white as that, but that's the basis of it. And then this can then come through in our relationship to food. So it can be as direct as we did something well, we got rewarded with food. We did something naughty, food was then used as a form of punishment against us. And so hence we're going to grow up being conditioned to have that disordered eating with food. In cases of bullying and also abuse, we may have found, ourselves positive reinforcement with food. So not directly by our caregivers, but as in, we may have to escape from the abuse and bullying that we were feeling. Food when we are younger is readily available and it can be a great comfort. So hence, we learn to then build that association by food giving us comfort. It's our friend, it's there for us, and it feels really good. And so it's then all the time positively reinforcing to us that food is good, go and eat food. And again, going back to those neural pathways, it happens then so often that we don't even realise why we are turning to food when we're in adults. Another form of conditioning that I see is food being used as a protection mechanism. Again, in cases of sexual abuse or other types of abuse, physical, psychological abuse, by keeping ourselves, overweight, that it's a form of protection and that nobody will want to know me. I won't get unwanted advances, and perhaps adult won't come near me because they won't want to know, the overweight kid. And so that's a form of getting to know and positive reinforcement, because if no one then touches us again because we're overweight, that's a good thing, right? And especially as a child, that could really keep us safe, and keep us protected. But as an adult, we learn to, stand up for ourselves, and we may not get those unwanted attentions anymore. And suddenly the weight then is no longer appropriate. We don't want this weight anymore, but we don't know why we're overweight because we just can't put the connection together. Suppression. Our brains have a fantastic way, and our bodies are amazing at keeping us safe and keeping us, protected in some ways, because when we have experienced trauma again and again, it can be too overwhelming for the brain to cope with. Right? And in fact, if we were to cope with everything at once, this could have a huge detrimental effect. So our brain has these mechanisms to be able to cope with them, and one of those is suppression. And what we do is we simply forget all of this trauma that has happened to us. And then hence why it's very, very difficult for us to make this connection between, our weight and also our trauma, because we may remember like huge things, but we may not remember loads and loads and loads of times of minor trauma. And so when this is then carried on, the trauma again and again, the more that we learn to suppress it, because we want to feel good and it keeps us feeling good. So this is where going to a therapist really helps to unlock all of these suppressed emotions. It doesn't mean it all comes flooding up at once. It's all done in a safe time. But our brains also have a great way, it's called plasticity, of being able to change and change to the environment. So when you're in a therapy setting, it's a safe environment, and our brains learn that it's safe to, offload these emotions, and then we're able to learn new and better ways of coping, and this is what helps change our eating habits.